Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Mr. Spencer and myself, Brad, here to talk to you today about some war stories from the pen test stuff that we do. And so we've been kind of bouncing around the idea of having one of these and for some time, and we think now's a good time to do it. And so that's what we want to talk to you about. They're just cool stories, right? They're just fun to listen to, fun to talk about, and they're usually pretty interesting. At least we think so. So as usual, if you like the material that we're putting out, like, subscribe, but most importantly, share with your friends and help us get the word out about what we're doing here. So, Spencer, do you want to take the floor with your first war story from the trenches?
Yeah, in kind of the pre-show, we were talking about taking notes and in what we wanted to talk about. And I mentioned that it was hard to think back on the hundreds of pen tests we've done in the last year or so, right? Me specifically doing internals, doing dozens and dozens of internals in the last year or so. It's interesting to think about all of the unique situations that you come across in kind of the shake your head moments or things like that. So the ones I'm going to share are the ones that I could kind of think of, right off the top of my head in the last, 10, 15 minutes. Sure. We'll probably have more. I mean, we definitely have more. Right? Yeah. But maybe we'll do another one down the road with a few different interesting other ones. So I'm going to start off with one. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think as we have openings in our schedule for podcast topics, we'll throw war stories in there periodically. So, if you guys really enjoy this format of us telling stories and stuff, let us know. Hit us in the comments if you're on YouTube or just message us on the website, offsec.blog, and reach out if you like this kind of stuff, and we'll do more. So. Yeah,
and hopefully this serves as a lesson to us all as, what not to do, and maybe it gives you some ideas of things to look for in your environment. Maybe if you're not sure if these things are possible in your environment, maybe go check, and you might be surprised. Who knows?
Agreed.
So free pen test for you. So the first one I want to talk about has to do with Windows tasks. So Windows tasks, task scheduler in Windows, you can create a task and run it as a user, and all fine and dandy. Well, on a recent pen test, I got access to a server. So I was on an internal workstation, got access to a server. On that server, there was a scheduled task running as a domain admin. So that right there is kind of a red flag already. A task running as domain admin is kind of a no-no. It's really too many privileges than it probably needs. So that right there is kind of a no-no. But then as I looked into it, it was running a batch file that was on a file share. So on that file share, that particular file share, domain users had full control of that entire shared folder. So it had a whole bunch of scripts in it. It had batch files, it had scripts, it had a whole bunch of stuff. It looked like for reporting and kind of analytics and daily type of tasks that admins had automated, right? So the Windows task was running as domain admin, and it was running a batch file, or it was executing a batch file from a file share where domain users had full privileges. So all you had to do at the point to kind of abuse that, right, is modify the batch file.
Yeah.
Wait for the script to run, and away you go. So that one is pretty interesting. That one we see in some combination pretty much on every test. Whether it's a file share that has insecure permissions or a task that's over-permissioned, with a over-permissioned service account, you name it. This is a very common thing. And, it's kind of an interesting thing. It's like a one-click domain admin. You just, modify the batch file and there you go.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, and dude, that stuff's been around forever. So, you took over doing internals from me about 1.5 years ago, I think. Yeah. And so, my knowledge is a little bit antiquated because I basically stopped doing internal pen tests that long ago, which for those of you that live in the pen test world isn't an eternity. Everything has changed since I was doing internal pen testing. But even back then, that's the first place I go, man. There's almost 100% of the time, there's like an IT share that is publicly available on the domain controller, or it's just a bunch of scripts in the GPO distributed share. And you would just go rifle through that like you were digging through somebody's trash, man, and you would find so many gems.
Yeah, and one of the first things you told me, when I started doing the internals is you can pretty much guarantee with a high level of confidence that the servers are not going to be as well protected as the
Yes.
workstations because admins use the servers, they do administrative work on them, it interferes with their work, and they get annoyed and they turn it off, right? Or
Mhm.
they disable things, or they put exceptions in for certain folders and files and things like that. So servers are a prime target.
Yeah.
And so when you're on an internal, like you get access to a server, I'm like, rubbing my
Right.
hands together. I can't wait to see what I can find on these servers, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the first things I check. It's like I would go right to the task and like, oh, look, service count. I bet you that's running as a privileged user. So
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. I think everybody just assumes that, the incident is going to start at the endpoint, and that's where all of our security controls should be. And I'm not super worried about servers. And
yep.
I will tell you, even test servers and dev servers, but I digress. So mine is from an external penetration test that we actually did a little over a year ago. And it was funny because, I don't pen test a lot anymore. I still do web. I still do some mobile and some external and stuff. But this particular one, we had the availability. So we had the entire team on a WebEx session, and we were all basically pen testing as a group. And I got super lucky because how often does a pen test go from external to internal? It's pretty rare. In this particular case, we were working with, and those of you that follow the podcast closely have probably heard me refer to this pen test because it's internally, it's just really a legendary pen test, right? And so anyway, long story short is, we were trying to figure out how to get inside their environment. We managed to compromise an old account, and it was a college. And so we managed to compromise a student account, and the student had graduated like 5 years ago. Like, it was a really old account, but it had never been cleaned up. And thus the password had been reused by that student in other places. And so we basically just grabbed their password off of a compromised password website, plugged it into their email address at the university, and we were able to log into their student portal, which in and of itself, not really that big of a deal, right? But all of the student access components were linked to a student Active Directory environment. And therefore, that we knew at that point, we were like, once we realized it was LDAP, we were like, oh, smokes, dude, that means we have an actual domain account. So then we started hunting across the perimeter of this university to try to find places like SSL VPNs or, other types of remote access where we could plug those creds in. And we found an old lab environment that had, I think it was VMware Horizon, if I'm not mistaken. And so we were able to plug the credentials in, and boom, before you know it, we loaded a desktop inside their network. And really, we kind of, at that point, my job was over, and we handed everything over to you. And so, do you want to continue the story? Because basically, we both get to play at this one,
Yeah, definitely. And so for everybody listening in, just know that if we're pen testing your environment and something like that does happen, everything stops, right? Like we stop.
Yeah.
We communicate with the client, and we make sure that is the client is aware, and we give them the decision, right, to proceed or to stop right there and call it quits. In this instance, the client was like, "Yeah, I mean, you got in. Let's see how bad this could be." Right.
Right.
So the first thing I did was curb roasting. So I'm like, what is going to be a potentially a guaranteed win, right?
Mm-hmm.
Curb roasting, right? If I can get the service count hash and crack it, and I could potentially be domain admin within just a few minutes, right? So we curb roasted the domain. We curb roasted the built-in administrator account had a service principal name configured, so an SPN. Yep. Now, for those of you maybe unaware, having a SPN on the built-in administrator account is
bad juju,
again,
man.
Yeah. A no-no. You shouldn't be really using the built-in administrator in that way. But nonetheless, this built-in administrator account had an SPN set, so we curb roasted it, got the hash, and I think we cracked it within a minute or two.
It was short.
I mean, it was it's like a 9-character password with like maybe 1 or 2 special characters or something. So not super complex. Unfortunately, not a super strong password. So we cracked it, And the built-in administrator account, as you know, is in the administrator group of the domain. So, and it was a single domain, and at that point, it's pretty much game over. We can go further and pivot to different systems, but we've shown kind of the risk, right? We got in, we curb roasted, no alerts were raised, and we got access to a administrative account in the domain. So
yep.
that was a wild one. That was
yeah.
From a pen tester standpoint, exhilarating, right? You get in, not only you get internal access, you curb roast, you get a domain admin account. It's like, wow, that's like the coup de grace of pen testing if you're doing that. So it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it almost felt like a capture the flag thing. It was like, is this real? Are we actually doing this right now? So yeah, definitely a fun one. All right, you want to take the next one?
Yeah. So this one again has to do with cracking passwords. So this one was also really exciting for me. This was a highlight moment for me in the last year and a half. So I'm doing a pen test for I think it was a credit union, and they had a very strong network, like very secure network. Things were pretty well done. There was a couple high critical findings that they had, but overall they were doing a really good job. They were very security conscious. They were rather mature for compared to their peers, and they were doing a good job. And so much so that they were using passphrases. Everyone in the organization, and they even discussed this, I think, in the pre-call and kickoff call with them, is they use passphrases. So everyone in their environment had 20 plus character passphrases. So I'm like, wow, that's awesome. Good job.
I think they told us that, didn't they? Like kind of going into it, and we were like a little intimidated.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like, wow. I'm like, okay. Like,
we're not getting any passwords on this one.
Good on you. And so, yeah, that was my exact thought, was like, I'm not even going to bother running Responder or Inve. Like, why bother, going down that route and trying to crack things. But as the pen test progressed, I started, running into hurdles and coming across things that I was like, well, this is a dead end or whatever. And it was like, well, I've got time, it's part of my process to kind of look for NTLM on the network and NBNS and try and capture hashes and crack them. So I want to make sure I do it for full coverage. And sure enough, like I ran Inve on the environment. I was on a Windows host, ran Inve, captured a whole bunch of hashes. And sure enough, I cracked 4 20 plus character passphrases. So four 20 character passphrases. And I was like, I just, when you like cracking
fall out
passwords,
of your chair, man.
But like you set up Hashcat to run, and you just like you run it and you go do something else, right? So that's what I did. I let it run, and like I didn't check it for a few hours or something. Like, oh, there's no point. Like I'm just gonna go check it later, right? Yeah. I come back and like exactly, I was like 4 20 character passphrases. I was floored. I was like, that's insane. But then you look at the password and you kind of understand why. Right. Yeah. And, we discussed this with the client, and I think we've talked about this on a podcast before, but when you use passphrases, it's important to make sure they're not, well-known song verses or well-known phrases like "May the force be with you" or "Force be with thee." Common things like that will get cracked, even if they are 20 characters. So yeah, but that was a fun one.
That's awesome. Yeah, I remember being super surprised by that too. Okay, so I'm going to move over to web pen testing for a minute. And one of the engagements, and I think Darius and I were both working on this engagement together. For those of you following along, it's not uncommon for multiple pen testers to be on the same engagement, right? It just depends on what's going on. It depends on a number of factors. But anyway, we were working on this, and we found a file upload opportunity. Let's call it an opportunity, right? So you can upload like Word, Microsoft Word, so like docx or PDF or anything like that. And it was like a report template. And we're testing in a dev environment, right? Or a test environment or whatever. It's a non-production environment. And we prefer to do that, especially for web applications, because we don't want to negatively impact production, which if we have enough time, I have another story about impacting production. But anyway, so we're testing the file uploads, and everything that we're doing is not working. And so we start tampering with the file types and the MIME headers and all that stuff. And eventually we finally get a web shell to upload. And so, but we have the problem of finding where it's at. And so we keep working at it, and we're naming the file like really obvious file names. And so we finally find the web shell, we get the web shell to load. And then when we do a who am I, we're a domain admin on the production network. And we're just like, we look at each other and we're just like, no way.
Man.
We have to stop. We have to stop here because, this is a multinational organization that services financial clients on, I think, every continent except for Antarctica. Like, they're huge, and we're just like, the potential for us to absolutely tear something up right here is big. And so what we realized in talking with the developers and the sponsors for the project is that they didn't have time to set up a file processing system. So they basically pointed test our environment at the production environment because they didn't see any harm in that, which, I mean, I can understand why they would feel that way. And they're just like, yeah, we'll just use the file hosting environment in production. And so the reason we were having such a hard time finding the file is because it wasn't landing on the test system. It was landing on a completely different URI in production, and then when we finally figured that out, we were just like, whoa, flag on the play. We're done for the day. Let's call, our buddy and see what's going on. So that was a lot of fun because we put a ton of effort into it and then realized we compromised production. And we were like, hey guys, this is not okay.
Yeah. What a gut wrenching feeling, right? Being on the other side and receiving something like that. I definitely empathize with IT teams in all of these cases.
Point of note. They caught us, by the way. That file, since it was a web shell, ended up triggering an event with their SOC, and they ended up figuring it out. But it was hours later, so we would have already done what we were going to do.
Yep. Man, that's nuts. Crazy.
Yeah. Scary
crazy
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll talk about another one. Again, this is internal Active Directory oriented finding.
What a surprise.
What a surprise.
Knowing you. Yeah. Spencer really beats up on Active Directory. All right, go ahead.
I do. No, I do. And this one kind of made me like blink my eyes, right? You're looking at something, you're not quite sure. You're seeing what you're seeing.
Am I hallucinating? Yeah, exactly.
And so much so that I had to validate it multiple times. I was like, wait, is this right? Is this, I checked it with multiple tools. And ultimately what happened was, I'm on the pentest and I'm doing my normal workflow and normal TTPs and whatnot and all that fancy stuff. And eventually, one of the things I like to do is I like to use the adeleg tool, which is like a delegation viewer for Active Directory. And it shows you, domain admins and members of domain admins, and it shows you, what delegations are configured and what permissions the accounts and groups have and all sorts of fun stuff. And if you know what to look for, you can find some low-hanging fruit that way. So low-hanging fruit would be if domain users has, full control over, like some IT,
like a GPO or an OU or something. Yeah,
exactly. So you can find misconfigured ACLs that way pretty quickly if you know what to look for. So I'm going through it, I'm looking, and eventually I get to a delegation where it says everyone. So it says everyone, and then on the other side of the window, if you know what it looks like, it says the domain. It was like domain.com or .local or whatever it was, right? It's domain.com, and it said full control. It said write all properties, everything. So it said all of the properties in the little window. And I was like, wait a minute, what? Is this saying that everyone has full control over the root forest? I'm like, that can't be.
Yeah. If we had sound effects, this is where they would be handy, right? It'd be like, what? Yeah. No way.
And so it's like, and then I totally assumed the tool was wrong. I was like, no, there's no way. This must be some bad data or something. So I fired up Active Directory users and computers, and I went to right click on the root forest, properties, advanced or whatever the tab is, security, and you look at the permissions in Active Directory itself, and sure enough, it was right there. And I was like, no.
Okay, so I want to time out for a second. There is a substantial difference between Active Directory users, like the domain users group, okay, which is technically everyone that is authenticated. There is a big difference between Active Directory users and everyone, right? Everyone is unauthenticated users. Am I right?
Yeah.
So like that is
Typically, yeah.
right. So like if there were a guest user that was enabled, it would qualify as everyone. And so, like at least if it were domain users, like they would still have to authenticate to leverage this. Potentially everyone could be anyone.
Yep. And in a lot of cases, there are there are remnants of a legacy configuration in Active Directory that gives, it allows something called null authentication, which is what you're talking about. So it's the Windows 2000 like legacy support group. I forget the exact name of it. But there's a certain configuration that allows null authentication, and that group of everyone would allow that. So yeah, it could be pretty scary. Kind of a configuration, and you go to the client and they're like, we have no idea. We've got a couple new IT staff. We've cycled people in to IT. There's people that have left that had domain knowledge, and they couldn't figure out how that happened, why it happened, when it happened, and so it was kind of a crazy scenario. If there was this really ugly configuration, nobody knew how it got there.
Right. Oh, that's scary, man. That's scary. Good to catch.
Yeah.
Catch that for sure. Okay. So I've done an external, I've done a web. I'm going to do a social engineering engagement. We have done more of these lately. They're becoming popular again. And I think in lieu of, or I guess in light of some recent events, right, that have been in the news in the last 6 months or so. But anyway, so there was an organization, I want to say it was a law firm, and they leveraged a third party for their IT support, right? So if you needed a password reset, or if you needed technical support, you would call this third party and they would provide that service. And we were testing them. Now, in a scenario like that, we have to get permission from the third party, right? I'm not going to attack a third party without their knowledge. And so we contacted like the IT manager, like the support manager person. And we were like, hey, we're gonna try to take over some of this firm's accounts. Are you cool with that? He's like, oh yeah, we have great processes in place. And we're like, awesome, dude. So that's what we're going to be testing. He's like, no, you don't understand. There's no need. We are that good. And I was like, dude, well, then this is going to be a quick test and it's going to be a short report, right? And so we waited, and I want to say the way that we got around everything is that we waited until there was a really important ball game on, like a sporting event. And we suspected that everybody would be watching that sporting event because it was based in the same physical location as the support staff. And so, we called the after hours number and we got the answering service. Now, this is an important part of the conversation because you're going to trust your answering service as an authority on information, right? So we told the answering service, hey, we're employee so-and-so, we'll call it Sarah. My name's Sarah, and I can't get into my account. Here's my name. And since I can't get to my work email, I'm going to give you my personal cell phone number, and I'm going to give you my Gmail account. That way, if you need to reach me, you can. And we made up a Gmail account from the name that we stole from LinkedIn, right? And so, long story short, the answering service forwards this data package over to the on-call engineer who is watching the game. And so, he calls us and he's like, yo, Sarah, listen, I'll make this super quick. I'm really busy. And we're like, oh, are you watching the game too? And we just started this super cool conversation. And they're like, yeah. So, and they trusted the phone number because the number and the email address was provided to them by the answering service. It didn't come from us, even though it did. It came from the answering service. And by the end of the call, they had even offered to set up MFA on the phone number that we gave them through, via the answering service. And we were able to authenticate, log in, take over the account using MFA that they had set up for us on that cell phone number. And it was awesome. They were super helpful and we were in. Yeah.
What a rush doing that. But also, it's funny because usually when somebody says, oh, we're rock solid, those are the ones that are sometimes the most fun to test because
sure,
they know they've got good processes, right? But it's further helping them validate, but it's also kind of rewarding too when you kind of get through and
sure,
you succeed in an attempt like that.
Yeah, and look, man, there's some person smarter than me said this, right? Every plan fails to survive contact with the enemy, right? And
Yep.
and when you get into a situation like that where, and of course we do all the tricks, right? It's a sense of urgency. If I don't get this done right now, I'm going to get fired. You're going to cost me my job. I really need your help. And we were like playing, babies crying in the background on speakerphone and just like really making it dramatic. And so when you add in all those variables and all of that, people just tend to do the right thing, which is not always, unfortunately, the process. And
Yep.
so it's human nature, right? Humans are always the weakest point. So
Yep. Definitely. Um, well, you haven't talked about the gift cards one yet, right?
I have not. Do you want me to do that one real quick?
I really like that one. Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's an interesting one, and I think it's a bit different from the other ones. So why don't you share that? Well, and then if we have time, I have one more we can share.
All right, cool. So we're doing a web pen test on at an organization who is offering this incentive program to their employees. And so it was a public facing web application internally developed, and it was incentivizing being a donor, like a blood donor. And so you would go and you would give blood, and then you would go to this website and you would submit that, hey, I gave 1 unit of blood on this day at this time, and they would issue you like a $20 gift card to Amazon as a reward for being a donor. And so what we realized, though, is that it asked you for your employee ID to log in, but it wasn't really validating anything about the data that surrounded that. Like if you had a valid employee ID, and their employee ID was like a 5-digit number. So we were just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, we're Jimmy Carter. And so we would log in, and then you could change the place where the gift card would be mailed. You could modify the mailing address. But what we realized is that there was not any real validation on the data systems behind it. And so we wrote a script that would just continuously submit donor information to the backend database, bypassing the front end UI. And I think at the point that the database failed, we had like $60,000 in Amazon gift cards that was going to be coming to us. And so we actually intentionally put in a false address, and then we called the sponsor and we were like, hey, please don't mail those gift cards. And the worst part about this is another reason we don't like testing in production, is it was a production system. They didn't have a test system. They didn't have a dev system. It was the only system they had. And to make matters even worse, the testing that we did ended up corrupting the database, and it was not backed up.
Yeah.
And so it went down hard and never came back. And that was the end of the blood donor app for this organization, unfortunately. But there were a lot of lessons to be learned there, right? A lot of lessons. This was like many years ago. And so we have since amended our processes. We've changed our testing procedures. The very first time we find, and it was a SQL injection vulnerability that allowed us to bump up the values of the gift cards. And so since then, once we discover like an active functional SQL injection, it's flag on the play, timeout, call the sponsor. Hey, here's what's going on. What do you want us to do?
Yep.
Because of things like that. And we also, I don't think we've tested in production since.
Yep.
Because we made an exception. Like just this once, we'll test in production for you guys. And then boom, the thing craters. And we're just like, okay, we're never doing that again.
Yeah. And there's kind of a movement lately I've seen, on the Twitterverses of people kind of advocating against testing SQL injection with or 1 = 1, because you don't know the underlying SQL commands that are being used. You don't know if there's inserting and deleting. You don't know what's going on.
That's right.
So I see there's a kind of a movement to shy away from that and remove that from checklists and documentation and testing guidelines and stuff.
Yeah, and look, man, this just further illustrates why vulnerability scanning will never replace penetration testing, and that is that in order to detect correctly and understand what is going on with things like SQL injection, you need a human being there. Otherwise, you're going to break stuff, or you're going to get a tremendous amount of false positives. So,
Yep.
in this case, we ended up breaking something, but it was because we were kind of goofing off a little bit. You know, we were like, oh wow, look, we can get an extra gift card. What if we got 20,000 of them? Woo, 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 woo. You know, and before you know it, the database just like falls over, and we're like, oh, that wasn't a good idea.
Yep. Oops.
Indeed.
So I'll share one more. It'll be quick, and then we'll wrap this up. So this is kind of one of my favorite Active Directory attacks. So how it went was on an internal pen test, I got access to a server, and I got access to administrator on that server. And during the course of my normal, Active Directory enumeration, I find out that this server has unconstrained delegation configured on it. And also through enumeration, I see that the domain controllers have the spooler service running and they're accessible remotely. So if you're a pen tester, you kind of get a sense of where this is going, but this leads itself to what's called unconstrained delegation. So there was unconstrained delegation configured on this server. And essentially what that means is the TGT of a service ticket is preserved in memory. So in combination with that, with the spooler service being available on a domain controller and accessible remotely, you can do something called coerced authentication. So you can convince or coerce the domain controller through the spooler service to authenticate to a specific host. Mm-hmm. So how it kind of works is I'm admin on a server. I can access things in memory. I use the spooler service on a domain controller and say, hey, send me your credentials or your ticket. And since it's a domain controller, it's the domain controller's machine account ticket, right? So I coerce the domain controller through the spooler service to send me on the compromised server its ticket. And now I have a ticket as the DC. So I become, like the DC, and I have access to that. And I can access the file system and kind of have my way with the domain controller at that point. I can DC sync. I can do all sorts of fun stuff. And this one is kind of a hidden danger because unconstrained delegation is a checkbox, and the spooler service is just the service itself, running or not. And we see this a lot of times where there's a lot of remote offices where their domain controller is their file and print server. It's, their everything server. And it's a remote office. They just have like one or two servers. The danger, again, is coerced authentication. You can also use that to relay your authentication. So coerced authentication is a big thing, and spooler service is one of those things that really makes that pretty scary. And then you combine that with unconstrained delegation, and again, you can get tickets, Kerberos tickets in memory, and kind of impersonate accounts, relay those, and it's a lot of fun to exploit. You kind of do a couple things and you do it, and it's really fun when it happens and you do it. So it's kind of one of those pentesty hacky kind of things that kind of just gives you that hacker feel, right? Like I did something super hacky. But that's a fun one when you get to do that.
For me, the super nerd, like multi-step process where you kind of step through, you do this thing and it leads you to this next thing. Like those are my favorite. Those are my favorite war stories to tell because, we didn't run a tool. In some cases we ran multiple, but it's not as simple as, we ran this thing and the output told us that there was a vulnerability. It was like, hey, based on our knowledge and our expertise, we can 3-step our way to, this really cool place, that creates a ton of opportunity for us to do bad stuff. So, I mean, that's really what we did this job for, right? This kind of stuff that we just covered in this podcast is why we became pen testers, is because it's super cool. It's super fun. Are we total nerds? Absolutely. And I'm not going to apologize for it. So, all right. So folks, that's all we have for you today. We're out of time. If you enjoyed this, please like, follow, subscribe, share. It's the best way you can help us out. We will see you next Wednesday.